Let's be clear about what 40 million actually means. That's not a rounded estimate. That's not researchers guessing. That's more people than live in the entire country of Canada. Imagine every single person in Texas. Now add every single person in Florida. Now imagine all of them disappearing at once. That's the number we're talking about. But here's what makes this different from any religious decline in American history. These weren't Christmas and Easter Christians. These weren't people who showed up twice a year in clothes bought the night before. These were the core. The volunteers who arrived 2 hours early to run sound checks. The small group leaders who hosted Wednesday nights in their living rooms for a decade. The families who gave 10% of their income without question, year after year. These were the people other Christians looked at and said, "That's what commitment looks like." And they left anyway. Researchers tracked what happened next. The numbers are stark. 15% joined smaller churches. 10% found house churches or informal gatherings. But 60% just stopped. No new church, no replacement community, no public announcement. They simply stopped showing up. 24 million people, gone from pews, gone from small groups, gone from the entire structure that once organized their week, their friendships, their identity. And here's what should unsettle you. They didn't renounce God. They didn't become atheists. They didn't join another religion. Many still check the box Christian on surveys today. So what happened? What could make 24 million deeply committed people walk away from something they'd built their entire lives around? The answer isn't what most people think. It's not about scandal. It's not about politics. It's not even really about God. It's about a model. A model built in the 1980s. A model that promised something it could never actually deliver. And to understand how it collapsed, you first have to understand how it conquered America in the first place. Rewind to 1985. Church, back then, felt like a museum. Old hymns nobody understood. Pews that creaked. Sermons that assumed you already knew the Bible cover to cover. Attendance was dropping. Young families were staying home. Then something changed. A new kind of church appeared, and it broke every rule. No hymnals, no pews, no stained glass. Instead, a rock band on stage, comfortable theater seating. A pastor in jeans, talking like your friend, not your priest. They called it seeker-friendly. Remove every barrier. Make faith feel easy. Make church feel like something you'd actually want to attend. And it worked. It worked spectacularly. Willow Creek, outside Chicago, went from 0 to 20,000 people in 2 decades. Saddleback, in Southern California, followed the exact same path. By the mid-2000s, America had 1,600 of these churches, each one drawing 2,000, 5,000, sometimes 20,000 people every single Sunday. These weren't just big churches anymore. They were empires. Budgets hit $15 million a year. Staff rosters climbed to 70, 80, 100 employees. Multiple campuses spread across entire cities. Parents drove 40 minutes, passing 5 other churches, just to get their kids into one specific program. This was the future of American Christianity. Everyone said so. Pastors flew across the country to study these models. Books were written. Conferences were held. By every visible measure, this was success. But here's what nobody was checking. Underneath the growth, underneath the packed parking lots and the standing room-only services, something was already breaking. 5 specific cracks, forming quietly, invisible to anyone just counting heads on a Sunday morning. The first crack was money. Here's how the megachurch financial model worked. Big building, big staff, big programming. All of it running every single week without stopping. A church with 5,000 attendees might carry $8 million in mortgage debt, 80 employees on payroll, utilities, insurance, maintenance, technology, all of it fixed cost, every single month. The math only worked one way. The church had to keep growing. Not just maintain, grow, every year. More people, more giving, more expansion. And for 2 decades, it did. But here's the problem with building everything around perpetual growth. Growth always stops. Every church eventually hits a ceiling. Geography limits it. Demographics limit it. Market saturation limits it. And when growth stopped, the budgets didn't adjust. The mortgages didn't pause. The staff didn't shrink fast enough. One church in Virginia built everything around 7,500 weekly attendees. Their entire financial structure assumed that number would hold. Then attendance dropped to 4,000. Then 1,800. They were operating an $8,000 seat facility with fewer people than a small-town high school graduation. By 2024, they were done. The second crack was quieter, slower, and ultimately more devastating. It was the children. Specifically, what happened when those children grew up. The megachurch model was built by baby boomers and early Generation X who wanted church to feel less formal, less religious, more practical. They got exactly what they wanted. Their kids got it too. And their kids hated it. Millennials and Gen Z sat through years of professional worship productions and motivational-style sermons. They watched their parents get emotionally charged every Sunday, and then, by Wednesday, look no different from everyone else. A 2018 survey asked millennials, who grew up inside megachurches, why they left. The top answer wasn't about God. It wasn't about morality. It wasn't about doctrine. It was one word: authenticity. They felt like they were watching a performance, a very expensive, very polished performance, with fog machines and stadium lighting, and a pastor who seemed more like a celebrity than a shepherd. One former attendee in Colorado put it this way: "I grew up in one of these churches, loved it as a kid, but when I hit my 20s and real life started happening, job loss, a broken relationship, genuine doubt, I realized I had no foundation. Church had given me emotions. It had never given me anything to stand on." She left at 24. She's now 31. She hasn't been back. She is not an exception. She is the pattern. Researchers estimate that 70% of young people who grew up in megachurches leave by age 23. Some return. Most don't. And the ones who don't return aren't being replaced. The pipeline dried up. The third crack went to the very heart of what these churches were actually teaching. What were they producing in people? Not attendance numbers, not giving totals, not campus counts. The answer is uncomfortable. They were producing consumers. The entire megachurch model was built on one principle: remove barriers, make Christianity accessible, make it easy to walk through the door. Noble intention, catastrophic execution. Because in removing every barrier to attendance, they accidentally removed something else: depth. Sermons became self-help content. 10 steps to a better marriage. 5 ways to manage financial stress. 3 habits of spiritually successful people. Worship became emotional experience. Designed not to challenge. Designed to make you feel something. Theology became optional. Nobody wanted to scare away a first-time visitor with something too heavy, too demanding, too ancient. So they kept it light, week after week, year after year. And what they built was a congregation that could tell you exactly how church made them feel, but couldn't tell you what they actually believed, or why it mattered, or what to do when life fell apart and feeling good wasn't an option anymore. One pastor in North Carolina watched his 4,000-person congregation shrink to 400 over 6 years. "We spent 15 years perfecting the experience, And one day, I realized we had produced a generation of Christians who were emotionally dependent on the experience, but had no idea what Christianity actually was. When the culture shifted, they had nothing to hold on to. We had given them a feeling, not a foundation. His church closed in 2022. The fourth crack had many names: Mark Driscoll, Ted Haggard, Bill Hybels, high-profile, high-charisma senior pastors who became, over time, the entire reason people attended. This was leadership dependency, and it was structural, not accidental. Megachurches were deliberately built around singular personalities. The senior pastor wasn't just a spiritual leader, he was the brand, the vision, the reason the parking lot filled up on Sunday morning. His face was on the website, his books were in the lobby, his voice was in people's earbuds during their morning commute. The entire institution orbited around one person, which meant one thing: if that person left, everything left with them. The data is stark. 73% of megachurch closures happened within 5 years of a senior pastor transition. Mars Hill Church in Seattle is the most documented case. At its peak, Mars Hill operated across 15 campuses in 5 states. Weekly attendance hit 15,000 people. It was one of the fastest-growing churches in American history. Then, in 2014, the senior pastor resigned amid a string of leadership controversies. Within 4 months, every single campus had closed. 15 campuses, 15,000 people, gone in 4 months. Not because the theology changed, not because the worship got worse, because the one person the entire institution was built around was no longer there. No roots, no structure, no identity beyond one man's personality. Hundreds of churches followed the same pattern. Different names, same collapse. And then something happened that nobody predicted. Something that didn't just expose the cracks, it detonated them. March 13, 2020. The president declared a national emergency. And every church in America locked its doors. For institutions built entirely around the Sunday morning gathering, this wasn't an inconvenience. It was an existential crisis. Within 2 weeks, megachurches scrambled to move online, pastors preaching to rows of vacant seats. And something unexpected happened. The numbers went up. One megachurch in suburban Dallas averaged 6,000 in-person attendees before the pandemic. When they moved online, 18,000 households tuned in the first Sunday. Leadership celebrated. This was reach they'd never imagined. But here's what those numbers were actually revealing. Not growth, fragility. Because when the doors reopened, those 18,000 households didn't come back. 3,800 people showed up the first Sunday back, then 3,200, then 2,600. By 2022, they were averaging 2,100, a 65% decline from pre-pandemic numbers. Across America, the same pattern repeated. Churches that had counted on full parking lots discovered that most of their attendance had been running on autopilot. People came on Sundays because that's what they did on Sundays. It was routine, it was habit, it was social obligation. Not conviction, not commitment, not a choice they actively made each week. The pandemic broke the routine. And when people were forced to make an active, intentional choice about whether to return, millions quietly decided the answer was no. No dramatic exit. No angry letter to the pastor. Just a Sunday morning that looked different, stayed different, became permanent. The financial consequences were immediate and brutal. Churches operating on $12 million annual budgets faced 50%, 60%, sometimes 70% declines in weekly giving. Staff cuts came first, then campus closures, then deferred maintenance became ignored maintenance. Roofs leak, HVAC systems failed. Between 2020 and 2023, More than 4,000 large churches either closed permanently, merged out of desperation, or shrank below any reasonable definition of sustainability. 4,000. In 3 years. But here's what gets overlooked. COVID didn't cause the collapse. It revealed it. Every crack was already there. The unsustainable finances, the theologically shallow congregations, the personality-dependent leadership, the generational gap. COVID didn't create any of those problems. It just removed the one thing holding everything together: momentum. As long as the crowds kept coming, these institutions could ignore their structural weaknesses. The pandemic stopped the momentum. And without momentum, there was nothing left to hide behind. One former executive pastor in Tennessee described it this way: COVID didn't break our church. It showed us our church was already broken. We had been running on inertia for years. Crowds mistaken for community. Activity mistaken for transformation. Attendance mistaken for faith. When it all stopped, we had to face what we'd actually built. And what we'd built couldn't survive honest examination. His church of 5,500 closed in 2022. So now comes the question everyone wants answered. 40 million people. 5 years of accelerating collapse. Thousands of closed buildings. Where did they actually go? Researchers spent years tracking exactly where. What they found divided into 4 distinct paths. The first path was the smallest. About 15% found their way into smaller, older, traditional churches. Catholic parishes, Anglican congregations, Eastern Orthodox communities, Lutheran churches with liturgies centuries old. For people who had spent years in theologically shallow environments, that ancient formality suddenly felt like solid ground. They wanted roots. They wanted history. They wanted a faith that had survived centuries of cultural upheaval, not just decades of favorable demographics. One woman who spent 12 years in a megachurch described walking into an Episcopal service for the first time. Nothing was optimized for me. The liturgy was old. The pace was slow. And for the first time in years, I felt like I was participating in something real. She joined that congregation 6 months later. She hasn't left. The second path was taken by roughly 10%. House churches, informal gatherings, 6 to 20 people meeting in living rooms, around kitchen tables, in backyard spaces. No staff, no budget, no building. Just people committed to doing Christianity at close range, where performance was impossible and authenticity was unavoidable. Researchers who tracked them found retention rates dramatically higher than megachurches. People reported deeper relationships, greater theological engagement, more genuine personal transformation. Small, it turned out, had advantages that large could never replicate. The third path claimed another 15%. These were the spiritual independents. People who maintained genuine Christian faith, but completely abandoned institutional expression of it. They read serious theology, listened to in-depth biblical teaching through podcasts, engaged in online communities discussing Scripture with genuine rigor. But they never attended church, not because they rejected Christianity, because they concluded the institutional church added nothing to their faith they couldn't access more effectively elsewhere. Researchers call them spiritual independents. They are the fastest-growing segment of this entire population. Now add those 3 paths together: 15% in traditional churches, 10% in house churches, 15% as spiritual independents. That's 40%, which means 60%, approximately 24 million people, took a fourth path. They simply stopped. No replacement community, no alternative practice, no online engagement. They stopped attending, stopped reading, stopped praying, with any consistency. Researchers have a specific name for them: the don'ts. Not the knowns, the don'ts. The knowns never had religious affiliation. The don'ts were completely different. The don'ts were there, deeply, genuinely there, running the soundboard at 7 a.m., teaching the middle school small group, organizing mission trips, sitting in the front rows for a decade. And then one day, after years of investment and service, they did a quiet calculation. What has this actually produced in my life? And the answer wasn't enough to keep them in the building. When researchers interviewed thousands of the don'ts, their answers clustered around 4 themes. They felt used. Churches that preached generosity while building empires. That celebrated community while fostering loneliness. They felt deceived. The promise was transformation. The reality was programming. The promise was community. The reality was strangers who smiled on Sundays and disappeared on Mondays. They felt exhausted. Years of serving, attending, giving, performing Christianity without measurable change in who they actually were. And they felt foolish, like they'd invested years into an institution that cared more about their presence and money than their actual spiritual condition. One former megachurch member in Texas said it plainly. I gave 15 years to that church, tithed without fail, led a small group for 6 years, served on 3 different ministry teams. And when I got honest with myself, I couldn't point to a single way I had genuinely changed. I was busier, more involved, but not better, not more patient, more generous, more loving, just more exhausted. So I stopped, and nobody called, nobody checked in. After 15 years, when I stopped showing up, nobody noticed for months. That told me everything I needed to know. 24 million stories, different details, same conclusion. And here's what makes this permanent, in a way previous religious declines weren't. These people made an active, informed decision, based on lived experience. They weren't talked out of faith by a philosophy professor. They weren't seduced away by another religion. They tried institutional Christianity, gave it years, sometimes decades, and concluded it wasn't what it claimed to be. That kind of disillusionment doesn't reverse easily. Maybe it doesn't reverse at all. The buildings are still there. Drive through any American suburb and you'll see them. Massive structures that once held thousands. Some converted into fitness centers, event spaces, community colleges. Others sit empty with for lease signs, in windows that used to glow with Sunday morning activity. These aren't just abandoned buildings. They're evidence of a model that promised everything and delivered entertainment. The same instincts that created the megachurch haven't disappeared. The desire for rapid growth, the obsession with cultural relevance, the belief that the right methodology can manufacture genuine faith. New models emerging, different names, same underlying assumptions. Church plants that look like startup companies. Online communities promising authentic connection through digital platforms. Ministry models measuring success by social media engagement. Different metrics, same fundamental mistake. The assumption that packaging determines content. That if you perfect the delivery system, you can produce transformation. But transformation has never worked that way. Faith formation happens in small spaces, around tables, through relationships that cost something, in communities that demand something from you, not just something for you. The megachurch failed because it tried to industrialize something that can't be industrialized. Discipleship. The 24 million don'ts represent a generation who gave institutional Christianity an honest try and concluded it wasn't worth their continued investment. That judgment doesn't get reversed by better marketing or more compelling programming. It gets reversed by institutions that prioritize formation over growth, depth over accessibility, faithfulness over success. But most churches aren't interested in that trade-off. Growth feels like success. Numbers feel like blessing. Larger feels like better. And as long as those assumptions drive ministry, the cycle will repeat. Different buildings, different pastors, different strategies, same collapse. The 40 million who left aren't an anomaly, they're a preview. The cultural conditions that destabilized megachurches aren't resolving, they're accelerating. American culture is becoming more polarized. Generational differences are widening. The social consensus that made broad appeal Christianity possible is fracturing beyond repair. The churches that survive won't be the ones trying to recapture the megachurch magic. They'll be the ones built for a completely different world. Small, deep, committed, unapologetic. Churches that care more about who they're becoming than how many people they're attracting. The question isn't whether the megachurch model can be saved. It's already dead. The question is whether American Christianity can learn to build something that lasts before the next 40 million walk away. Because they're watching, and they're deciding right now whether what you're offering is worth their time. Their verdict will determine what survives, and what joins the empty buildings with for lease signs where worship used to be.